The morning of June 17th, 1944, Saipan Island, Mariana Chain. Corporal James Mitchell of the 2nd Marine Division crouched beside his M4 Sherman, listening to the distinctive rumble of diesel engines approaching through the pre-dawn darkness. The sound was wrong, not the deep, throaty roar of American power plants, but something lighter, higher-pitched. Japanese armor. Mitchell had heard stories from Marines who fought at Guadalcanal 2 years earlier. They spoke of Japanese tanks with a mixture of respect and caution, machines that had dominated Pacific battlefields in the war's early months. Now, as Commander Takashi Goto's 9th Tank Regiment advanced toward the Marine positions with 44 tanks, the largest Japanese armored assault of the entire Pacific War, Mitchell was about to discover something that would fundamentally change how Americans viewed Japanese military engineering. The Type 97 Chiha medium tank represented Japan's primary armored weapon, the backbone of their mechanized forces across Asia and the Pacific. Over 2,000 had been built since 1938, more than any other Japanese tank design except the smaller Hago light tank. Japanese tank crews trusted these machines, had fought in them from the frozen steppes of Mongolia to the steaming jungles of Malaya. They believed their Chihas were adequate, perhaps not equal to the best Western designs, but sufficient for the wars Japan needed to fight. They were catastrophically wrong. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The revelation of the Chiha's inadequacy would not come from some technical report or engineering analysis. It would come in the most brutal way possible, in combat, when Marine gunners discovered that weapons designed to destroy fortifications could punch straight through what was supposedly a medium tank's armor. When crews realized that the 37mm anti-tank guns they worried might be obsolete were devastating against Japanese armor. When Sherman tank commanders found their 75mm armor-piercing rounds passed completely through Chiha tanks without even slowing down, forcing them to switch to high-explosive ammunition just to damage the targets effectively. The story of how American Marines came to laugh at Japanese medium tank armor begins not with defeat, but with careful planning and rational decision-making that led inexorably to catastrophe. In the mid-1930s, the Imperial Japanese Army recognized a critical deficiency in its armored forces. The Type 89 medium tank, Japan's workhorse since 1929, could manage only 15 miles per hour. This was adequate for infantry moving at walking pace, the traditional tempo of warfare. But modern mechanized war demanded speed. Japanese officers had studied operation in Manchuria, where slow-moving tanks fell behind motorized infantry transported in trucks traveling 40 miles per hour. They observed military developments in Europe, where German panzer divisions demonstrated the power of mobile armored warfare. Spain's civil war provided additional lessons about tank employment and capabilities. The conclusion was clear. Japan needed a new medium tank. In July 1933, the Army Technical Bureau issued specifications. The new tank would weigh approximately 7 tons, carry a 57mm gun, achieve speeds of 40 kilometers per hour, and have armor sufficient to resist rifle and machine gun fire. Most importantly, it would be simple enough for Japan's industrial base to produce in meaningful quantities. Mitsubishi Heavy Industries received the contract. Engineer Tomio Hara, already respected for his work on the Type 89, accepted the challenge. His most significant innovation was the bell crank suspension system, a design that would become standard on Japanese tanks for the next decade. By June 1934, Mitsubishi had completed the first prototype. The prototype impressed military observers during extensive field trials. It was fast, reaching 45 kilometers per hour on paved roads and maintaining 25 to 30 kilometers per hour cross-country. It was maneuverable, with a turning radius that seemed impossible for a tracked vehicle. The Hara suspension absorbed shocks reasonably well, allowing the tank to traverse rough terrain that would stop other vehicles, and it was mechanically reliable, using a Mitsubishi 6-cylinder air-cooled diesel engine producing 120 horsepower at 1,800 revolutions per minute. The diesel engine was a source of particular pride for Japanese engineers. It made the tank less vulnerable to fires compared to gasoline-powered vehicles. Diesel fuel was also more readily available throughout Japan's expanding empire, particularly in Manchuria and Southeast Asia, where gasoline supplies were limited. The engine could run 8 to 10 hours on its internal fuel capacity of 34 gallons, giving the tank an operational range of approximately 130 miles on roads. But trials revealed problems that would prove prophetic. The suspension had a tendency to pitch violently on rough ground, making aiming while moving nearly impossible and causing severe crew fatigue. Engineers addressed this by adding braces connecting the bogie pairs, creating what became known as the Manchurian suspension. The modification helped, but never completely eliminated the rough ride that would characterize Japanese tanks throughout their service. In 1935, at a critical meeting in the Army Technical Bureau, the Type 97 was formally presented. Infantry representatives raised immediate concerns. They argued that 12 millimeters of armor was insufficient for a tank supporting infantry. Assaults against fortified positions. Cavalry representatives countered that improved speed and mobility compensated for thin armor, and that the tank's firepower was adequate for its intended role. After considerable debate, a compromise emerged. The infantry agreed to accept the design if armor thickness could be increased to 25 millimeters in critical areas. The modifications were made. In 1937, the Type 97 Chiha was officially adopted. The designation came from the Japanese imperial calendar, marking the 2597th year since the legendary founding of Japan. Only the last 2 digits were used in the type number. Production began at Mitsubishi facilities in 1938. The Chiha was indeed a medium tank by Japanese standards. It measured 5.5 meters long, 2.3 meters wide, and 2.2 meters tall. In American measurements, that was approximately 18 feet long, 7 feet 8 inches wide, and just over 7 feet tall. A man of average height could nearly look over the turret. The final weight came to 14.3 tons for the basic model, reaching 15.2 tons when fully loaded with crew, fuel, and ammunition. The armor, despite the modifications demanded by infantry commanders, remained thin by any contemporary standard. 25 millimeters at its thickest points on the turret front and hull front, 20 millimeters on the turret and hull sides, 10 millimeters on the roof, 8 millimeters on the floor. Japanese designers calculated this was sufficient to stop rifle and machine gun bullets at combat ranges. They were designing for the enemies they expected to fight: Chinese forces with limited anti-tank capability and lightly armored Soviet tanks encountered at the Manchurian border. Inside, the tank was cramped but workable. The crew consisted of 4 men. The driver sat in the front right of the hull with limited vision, through a small viewport and periscope. A hull machine gunner sat to the driver's left, operating a Type 97 7.7mm machine gun mounted in a ball mount. The commander and gunner occupied the turret, standing on the hull floor with no turret basket beneath their feet. This arrangement created significant operational challenges. The commander had to direct the tank, communicating with the driver through a system of 12 push buttons connected to lights and a buzzer. He had to coordinate with other tanks when possible, though only command tanks carried radio equipment. He had to observe the battlefield through limited vision devices, and he had to assist the gunner in operating the main armament. The main gun was a Type 97 57mm cannon, essentially the same weapon used on the obsolete Type 89. This was an infantry support piece, a low-velocity gun designed to destroy fortifications and suppress enemy positions with high, explosive rounds. It could fire armor-piercing ammunition, but the short barrel and low muzzle velocity meant limited effectiveness against armored targets. The gun had an unusual feature, a second set of trunnions that allowed only 10 degrees of traverse inside the turret. For major changes in aim, the entire turret had to rotate, operated by hand crank, requiring significant physical effort. A second Type 97 machine gun was mounted in the rear of the turret, pointing roughly toward the 5 o'clock position. This arrangement was intended to provide defense against infantry approaching from behind, but made the weapon difficult to employ effectively in combat. The turret could rotate 360 degrees, but slowly, entirely by muscle power. American tankers who later examined captured Chihas marveled that anyone could fight effectively under such conditions. The commander had to juggle multiple tasks simultaneously while standing in a cramped space with minimal visibility. The gunner had to aim and fire while also loading ammunition, a physical challenge made worse by the limited space and the need to manually traverse the turret. There was barely room to move, let alone perform complex combat tasks efficiently. But in its intended role, against the opponents it was designed to fight, the Chiha performed adequately, sometimes even well. The tank first saw significant combat in China starting in 1937, against nationalist forces that had virtually no armor and limited anti-tank weapons. The Chiha was effective, its 57mm gun destroying fortifications and suppressing infantry, its machine guns cutting down troops in the open, its mobility allowing rapid exploitation of breakthroughs. Japanese tank crews gained combat experience and confidence. They learned their trade in an environment where their tanks were clearly superior to anything they faced. This success bred a dangerous assumption that the Chiha was a genuinely capable tank rather than a vehicle optimized for a specific, limited scenario against poorly equipped opponents. That assumption faced its first serious test at Khalkhin Gol in 1939, where Japanese forces clashed with the Soviet Union along the Mongolian border. Here, the Chiha faced real opposition. Soviet BT-5 and BT-7 tanks mounted 45mm guns with higher muzzle velocity and better armor penetration than the Japanese 57mm weapon. Soviet armor was thicker, making frontal engagements difficult for Chiha crews. The battles were brutal and instructive. On July 2, 1939, the Japanese 3rd Tank Regiment, equipped primarily with Type 97 tanks, attacked Soviet positions. Initial assaults achieved some success through aggressive tactics and surprise. Japanese tanks destroyed 32 Soviet tanks and captured 35 armored vehicles in the opening engagements. But Soviet counterattacks in the following days revealed the Chiha's critical vulnerabilities. Soviet guns could penetrate Chiha armor at ranges where Japanese guns struggled to damage Soviet tanks effectively. The 45mm Soviet weapons outranged the low-velocity Japanese 57mm guns. Japanese tank crews found themselves taking casualties while unable to fight back effectively. By the end of the Khalkhin Gol campaign, Japan had lost dozens of tanks. The lessons were painfully clear to anyone paying attention. The Chiha was outmatched by modern Soviet armor. Its thin protection and relatively weak gun were not adequate for tank versus tank combat against peer adversaries equipped with purpose-designed anti-tank weapons. But these lessons were not fully absorbed by Japanese military leadership. Instead of fundamental redesigns, they focused on tactical improvements and crew training. The war in China continued, and there the Chiha remained effective against enemies who lacked modern weapons. Success in China overshadowed the warnings from Khalkhin Gol. Japanese engineers did begin work on an improved gun. Development of a 47mm high-velocity weapon began in 1939. This gun, designated the Type 1, had a longer barrel generating much higher muzzle velocity, resulting in armor penetration superior to the 57mm weapon. But development took time. The weapon wasn't completed until the end of 1941. Meanwhile, war expanded across the Pacific. When fighting erupted in December 1941, Japanese tank units achieved remarkable successes. In Malaya, Chiha tanks navigated terrain British commanders thought impossible for armor. They moved through rubber plantations and jungle trails, supporting the rapid Japanese advance down the peninsula toward Singapore. British forces, who had not deployed significant armor to Malaya, were unprepared for this mobile threat. The Chiha's relatively light weight, 14 to 15 tons, compared to 25 to 30 tons for contemporary Western medium tanks, proved advantageous in the jungle environment. The tanks could cross bridges designed for civilian traffic. They could navigate muddy tracks that would bog down heavier vehicles. Their diesel engines, less thirsty than gasoline power plants, required less logistical support in areas where fuel supply was challenging. In the Philippines, Chihas landed with invasion forces and supported Japanese infantry operations. The tank's low silhouette made it difficult to spot in jungle terrain. Its mobility allowed rapid movement between defensive positions. Against American and Filipino forces equipped primarily with light weapons, the Chiha seemed adequate, perhaps even formidable. These early victories reinforced Japanese confidence. From their perspective, the Chiha was performing exactly as designed. It was mobile, reliable, and effective in supporting infantry operations across diverse terrain. Tank crews trusted their machines. Commanders relied on their armor. The warnings from Khalkhin Gol seemed like isolated incidents, aberrations in an otherwise successful design. By 1942, Japanese engineers had completed the improved gun and designed a new turret to mount it. The Type 97 Shinhoto Chiha, literally New Turret Chiha, entered production. This variant mounted the 47mm Type 1 high-velocity gun in a larger, more angular turret. The new gun could penetrate more armor than the original 57mm weapon. Against American M3 Stuart light tanks, it was effective. Against British light armor in Burma, it performed adequately. The Shinhoto Chiha first saw combat at Corregidor in May 1942. A special company from the 2nd Tank Regiment was formed and sent to support operations against remaining American and Filipino forces. According to Japanese after-action reports, the improved tanks performed well, silencing several defensive positions and supporting the final assault. The success seemed to validate the upgrade, but the Shinhoto Chiha, despite its improved firepower, retained the same basic armor protection as the original model. Maximum thickness increased slightly to 33mm on the gun mantlet, but the hull sides remained 20mm, the turret sides 25mm, the roof 10mm. The fundamental design philosophy remained unchanged. Prioritize mobility and firepower, accept thin armor as the price of keeping weight manageable. This philosophy reflected Japan's strategic assumptions and industrial limitations. Japanese planners believed the war would be relatively short. Strike decisively, achieve territorial objectives, negotiate from strength. In a short war, tank attrition would be manageable. Long-term survivability was less important than immediate combat effectiveness. Japan's industrial capacity also constrained design choices. The nation lacked the massive steel production and manufacturing infrastructure of the United States or Soviet Union. Tanks needed to be simple enough to produce in quantities Japan's factories could sustain. Adding significant armor meant heavier tanks, which required more powerful engines, which required larger transmissions and stronger suspensions, which increased complexity and production time. American planners took a fundamentally different approach. They assumed a long war of attrition. Tank crews who survived being hit once would fight again, accumulating experience and becoming more effective. Therefore, crew protection justified its weight penalty. Armor was mandatory, not optional. Self-sealing fuel tanks, despite reducing fuel capacity, were required. Rugged construction was essential, even if it reduced performance. These different philosophies would collide on Saipan in June 1944, revealing the full extent of the gap between Japanese assumptions and battlefield reality. Saipan was strategically vital. The island in the Mariana chain sat just 1,250 miles from Tokyo. If Americans captured Saipan, their B-29 bombers would be within range of the Japanese home islands. The empire's leaders understood the implications. They fortified Saipan with approximately 30,000 troops, nearly double what American intelligence estimated. Among the defenders was the 9th Tank Regiment commanded by Colonel Takashi Goto. The regiment was equipped with 44 tanks, a mixture of Type 97 Chiha and Shinhoto Chiha medium tanks, along with Type 95 Hago light tanks. This represented a significant armoured force by Pacific standards, the largest concentration of Japanese armour yet committed to island defence. The Americans began their assault on June 15, 1944. Vice Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner ordered the landing force ashore at 5:42 hours. By 700 hours, landing aircraft were moving toward the beaches. At 8:40, the first wave hit the shore under heavy fire from Japanese artillery and mortars positioned on heights overlooking the landing zones. The 2nd and 4th Marine Divisions fought their way inland against fierce resistance. By nightfall of the 15th, 20,000 American combat troops were ashore. Equipment and supplies poured onto the beaches in massive quantities that astonished Japanese observers. Among the equipment were M4 Sherman medium tanks, landing from LST vessels and moving forward to support the infantry. The Marines established a beachhead, but it was not yet secure. Japanese artillery could still reach the beaches. Counterattacks continued through the night, probing for weaknesses, testing American defensive positions. On June 16th, Marines consolidated their positions and began pushing inland. The 2nd Marine Division worked to close gaps in the line, while the 4th Marine Division cleared areas around key terrain. General Holland Smith, commanding the assault force, committed his reserves, bringing elements of the 27th Infantry Division ashore to reinforce the beachhead. Lieutenant General Yoshitsugu Saito, commanding Japanese forces on Saipan, recognized the critical situation. If the Americans consolidated their beachhead and brought their full combat power ashore, dislodging them would become impossible. He needed to strike immediately, before they were fully prepared, using the island's most powerful assets. Saito issued orders for a major counterattack. The infantry of the 136th Regiment would assault American positions around Charankanoa airfield. The tanks of the 9th Tank Regiment would advance southwest of Hill 164.6, moving after the infantry attack commenced. The tanks would charge toward a transmitting station, throwing the enemy into disorder before the infantry penetrated the sector. It was an ambitious plan, requiring coordination between infantry and armour in a night attack across difficult terrain. Success would depend on surprise, aggressive execution, and the combat effectiveness of Japanese armour against American defensive positions. Colonel Goto gathered his tank crews for final preparations. They conducted maintenance checks on their vehicles, ensuring mechanical readiness. Crews loaded ammunition, 57mm rounds for the original Chi-Has, 47mm rounds for the Shinhoto variants. They filled fuel tanks, checked track tension, tested radios on the few command tanks equipped with them. The crews were confident, many with combat experience from China or earlier Pacific campaigns. They trusted their machines and their tactics. They had trained for night attacks, understanding that darkness could negate some of the advantages American forces held in firepower and air support. In the pre-dawn darkness of June 17th, the Japanese tank column moved out. Diesel engines coughed to life, their distinctive sound echoing across the pre-dawn landscape. Tracks clanked as tanks formed up and began their approach toward the American lines. Inside each cramped vehicle, crews felt the familiar vibration and noise of their tanks in motion. Commanders stood in their turrets when possible, trying to see through the darkness, coordinating movement through visual signals and limited radio communication. The Americans heard them coming. Marine sentries on the perimeter reported engine sounds from the north. The noise was distinctive, diesel engines at varying speeds, tracks throwing dirt and gravel, the mechanical clatter of multiple armoured vehicles moving in formation. Officers shouted orders. Men grabbed weapons and moved to defensive positions they had prepared during the previous day. Anti-tank gun crews traversed their 37mm M3 guns toward the approaching sounds, loading armour-piercing rounds. Sherman tank crews who had bedded down near their vehicles climbed aboard and started engines. Machine gun teams checked their weapons and ammunition, especially the crews manning Browning M 250 caliber heavy machine guns. At 3:30 hours, the Japanese attack began in earnest. 44 tanks, the largest armoured formation yet committed by Japan in the Pacific War, advanced toward the 2nd Marine Division's positions. Some tanks carried infantry clinging to the hulls, a dangerous but sometimes effective tactic that provided immediate infantry support when tanks reached enemy lines. The formation moved through the darkness, guided by lead tanks and following terrain toward their objectives. Japanese tank commanders opened fire with their hull machine guns, sweeping the ground ahead. Others reserved fire, trying to get closer before engaging, hoping to achieve surprise despite the noise of their approach. Then something happened that Japanese tank crews had not anticipated, something that would fundamentally change their understanding of their own equipment's capabilities. Marine machine gunners positioned in foxholes and behind cover opened fire with their Browning M2 heavy machine guns. These were not the standard infantry machine guns, the 30 caliber weapons that provided supporting fire. These were 50 caliber weapons, heavy machine guns originally designed to engage aircraft and destroy light vehicles. The 50 caliber Browning M2 was a formidable weapon. Designed near the end of World War I and perfected in subsequent decades, it fired a 12.7 mm round at a muzzle velocity exceeding 2,900 feet per second. The standard ammunition load included ball rounds for general use and armor-piercing rounds specifically designed to defeat light armor and fortifications. The armor-piercing variant, designated M2, could penetrate 23 mm of face-hardened steel armor plate at 200 meters. At 500 meters, it could still penetrate 19 millimeters. These were not theoretical numbers. They were verified test results, confirmed through extensive firing trials at American ordnance proving grounds. The ammunition had been designed primarily to engage lightly armored aircraft, but the mathematics of armor penetration are unforgiving. The Type 97 Chiha's armor was 25 millimeters thick at its maximum on the turret front and hull front. On the sides, it was 20 millimeters. The rear was 20 to 25 millimeters depending on location. The roof was 10 millimeters. The floor was 8 millimeters. Simple arithmetic revealed a catastrophic problem. At close range, the 50 caliber armor-piercing round could penetrate the Chiha's side armor with energy to spare. At the ranges where this battle was being fought, 200 meters or less as tanks closed with marine positions, the 50 caliber had more than sufficient penetrating power to defeat 20 millimeter armor. Marine machine gunners opened fire. Tracer rounds arced across the battlefield in brilliant orange-red lines. The sound was distinctive, the heavy boom 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 of 50 caliber machine guns firing at sustained rate. Gunners aimed at the advancing tanks, some not entirely certain their weapons would be effective against armor, but following orders and engaging targets as trained. What happened next shocked Japanese tank crews to their core. The 50 caliber armor-piercing rounds didn't just dent the armor. They didn't ricochet off at angles. They penetrated cleanly, decisively, punching through the thin steel plate as if it were sheet metal rather than armored protection. At close range, some rounds went completely through one side of the tank and exited the other, passing through the entire width of the fighting compartment. Inside the Japanese tanks, crews experienced something far worse than enemy fire. They experienced the collapse of fundamental assumptions about their own safety. The heavy machine gun fire wasn't just loud impacts on the outside of the hull, it was penetration, rounds coming through the armor, through what was supposed to protect them, entering the cramped interior where there was nowhere to hide. In the confined space of a Chiha, a penetrating round could strike engine components, ammunition racks, or crew members. The face-hardened armor, designed to resist rifle fire by causing bullets to shatter, offered no meaningful protection against the heavy 50 caliber rounds. The projectiles had sufficient energy to break through the hardened outer layer and penetrate the softer interior steel. One Marine machine gunner, firing his weapon from a position near the airfield, reported watching his tracer rounds strike a Chiha advancing directly toward him. The rounds hit the front hull, and he could see sparks inside the tank through vision ports and hatches. The tank kept coming for a moment, then slowed, then stopped. Engine smoke poured from the rear deck. The crew attempted to bail out. 2 men emerged before rifle fire from Marines in nearby foxholes forced them back inside. Another gunner, positioned with his weapon mounted on a half-track, engaged a Chiha at approximately 150 meters. He fired a sustained burst into the tank's side armor. The tank turned toward him, exposing more of its flank. He kept firing, his loader feeding another belt of ammunition into the gun. He watched the commander in the turret slump forward, then fall out of the open hatch. The bullet had gone through the thin turret armor, struck the man, and continued through the other side. A third Marine, manning a .50 caliber in a fixed position on the defensive line, engaged multiple tanks as they advanced. He fired at one Chiha's engine compartment, aiming for the rear deck where cooling vents were located. His rounds penetrated the thin armor covering the engine. The diesel engine, its cylinders opened by .50 caliber, impacts, seized. The tank stopped moving, becoming a stationary target. The crew abandoned it, running back toward Japanese lines through a hail of small arms fire. Japanese tank crews who survived those first minutes of contact couldn't process what was happening. They had trained for years. They had fought in China where enemy weapons bounced harmlessly off their armor. They had faced Soviet anti-tank rifles at Khalkhin Gol and survived. Their tanks were supposed to protect them. That was the fundamental premise of armored warfare. The tank's armor kept the crew alive while they engaged the enemy with superior firepower. But American machine guns were defeating their armor. Not anti-tank guns firing large-caliber projectiles. Not artillery. Not even the massive 75mm guns on the Sherman tanks they could see moving into position. Machine guns, infantry support weapons. Weapons that were mounted on jeeps, on half-tracks, on every vehicle in the American arsenal. The realization was devastating psychologically. If machine guns could penetrate their tanks, what chance did they have? A Japanese tank officer, later captured after his tank was disabled, told American interrogators that his first thought was that the Americans must have developed some new secret weapon, some advanced ammunition or special gun that looked like a standard machine gun but fired exotic projectiles. He simply could not accept that a conventional heavy machine gun could defeat a tank. In his entire combat experience, from training in Manchuria to fighting in China, small arms fire had always been ineffective against armor. Bullets made noise on the outside. They didn't come through. But the Browning M2, with its armor-piercing ammunition, was in an entirely different category from anything the Japanese had previously encountered. With sufficient energy and penetrating power to defeat 20mm armor at combat ranges, it had the capability to engage and destroy lightly armored vehicles, including the Chiha. And the Marines had these weapons everywhere. They were standard equipment throughout the American military. Every infantry company had heavy machine gun sections. Every weapons platoon included .50 caliber guns. Vehicles from jeeps to half-tracks mounted them. The weapons were so common that Marines considered them basic infantry support equipment, useful for suppressing enemy positions and engaging light vehicles, not specialized anti-tank weapons. As the Japanese tank attack faltered under this unexpected fire, Sherman tanks moved forward to engage. The contrast between the two tank designs was stark and unforgiving. Where the Chiha weighed 14.3 to 15.2 tons, the M4A2 Sherman used by Marines at Saipan weighed 31.8 tons, more than twice the weight of the Japanese medium tank. Where the Chiha had 25mm of armor on the frontal hull, the Sherman had 51mm. Angled at 56 degrees to provide effective protection equivalent to approximately 75mm against anti-tank fire. The sloped armor meant that projectiles striking the hull front had to penetrate through more steel than the nominal thickness, significantly increasing protection. The Sherman mounted a 75mm M3 gun as its main armament. This weapon could penetrate the Chiha's armor from over a mile away. When Shermans opened fire on the Japanese tanks, the outcome was predetermined by simple physics and engineering. 75mm armor-piercing rounds struck Chihas with devastating effect. Tanks were blown apart, turrets knocked off hulls, ammunition detonating inside crew compartments. Japanese tanks that returned fire found their weapons completely ineffective against the Sherman's frontal armor. The 57mm shells from original Chihas bounced off or created small dents without penetrating. Even the improved 47mm high-velocity rounds from Shin-Hoto Chihas could not penetrate Sherman frontal armor at combat ranges. One Japanese tank commander, whose Chiha was disabled by 50 caliber fire, but whose turret could still traverse, attempted to engage a Sherman at close range. He ordered his gunner to fire. The 47mm gun fired its armor-piercing round at a Sherman approximately 100 meters away. The projectile struck the Sherman's turret face. There was a flash of impact. The Sherman didn't even slow down. It continued to rotate its turret with mechanical precision, the powered traverse system moving smoothly. The Sherman's gunner acquired the target, aimed carefully using his telescopic sight, and fired a single 75mm round. The Chiha exploded. Ammunition inside the tank ignited, flames and smoke erupting from every opening. The crew had no chance to escape. The battle evolved into what one Marine officer later described as madhouse of noise, tracers, and flashing lights. Disabled tanks burned, their fires illuminating other tanks still trying to advance. Infantry that had been riding on the tanks scattered, seeking cover in shell holes and drainage ditches. Some Japanese infantry made it to the Marine lines, fighting desperate close-range battles in and around American positions. Marine infantry, hunkered in their foxholes, found themselves with Japanese tanks passing directly over them. One Marine later reported that a Chiha leaking oil heavily soaked him as it passed over his position. He remained still until it moved on, then emerged and threw a thermite grenade into the engine compartment as the tank moved past. The tank began burning from the inside, flames spreading rapidly through the engine bay. Another Marine, lying low in his foxhole as a tank rolled over him, jumped out after it passed and jammed a coconut log into the bogie wheels. The tank spun in place, tracks throwing dirt, unable to move forward or backward. When the confused tank commander opened his turret hatch to see what was wrong, the Marine jumped onto the tank and dropped a thermite grenade into the open turret. The tank exploded from internal fires, all ammunition igniting almost simultaneously. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. By mid-morning on June 17th, the Japanese counterattack was over. 31 destroyed Japanese tanks littered the battlefield, counted by Marines walking through the area after the fighting stopped. Some sources suggest as many as 35 tanks were destroyed when including those knocked out by artillery fire beyond the immediate battle area. Perhaps 1,000 Japanese soldiers were dead, including many of the tank crews and the infantry who had advanced with them. For the Marines, the victory was significant but costly. The 2nd Marine Division's commander later acknowledged that if the Japanese attack had succeeded, it would have been catastrophic to the division's fighting efficiency. The battle had been closer than some accounts suggested, decided as much by American firepower and Japanese tactical errors as by overwhelming superiority. But for Marines walking among the destroyed tanks afterward, examining the vehicles up close in daylight, a different truth emerged. The Japanese tanks were not the formidable war machines they had expected. They were surprisingly vulnerable, almost shockingly inadequate for modern combat against a well-equipped opponent. A Marine officer called his men over to look at a destroyed Chiha. He pointed to the holes in the armor. They were clean, round penetrations where 50 caliber bullets had punched through. The entry holes were relatively small, approximately half an inch in diameter. The exit holes on the far side were slightly larger, rough-edged, where the bullets had torn through after crossing the interior. Some Marines could put their fists through the exit holes. Inside the destroyed tank, the scene was worse. The cramped interior showed signs of multiple penetrations. Bullets had struck equipment, ignited ammunition, and killed crew members. The commander's position in the turret had no protective features, no armor thick enough to stop heavy machine gun fire. The manual traverse for the turret consisted of a simple hand crank, requiring muscle power to rotate. The gun controls were rudimentary. There was almost no space to move. The hull machine gunner's position was a small cubby with minimal visibility, just a narrow slot to see through and aim his weapon. The driver had a crude periscope and a small vision port. Everything was cramped, crude by American standards, and utterly vulnerable to 50 caliber fire. The armor plate itself felt thin when Marines tapped on it, perhaps an inch thick at most, closer to 3/4 of an inch in many places. Marines, who had fought at Guadalcanal 2 years earlier, remembered seeing Chihas there. At the time, with Marines equipped primarily with light weapons and no armor support of their own, the Japanese tanks had seemed threatening, dangerous opponents that required careful tactics to defeat. But now, with proper equipment, with heavy weapons and their own armor, the Chiha looked exactly like what it was, a light tank from the mid-1930s, adequate for colonial warfare and police actions, utterly inadequate for modern industrial warfare against a peer adversary. The psychological impact on surviving Japanese tank crews was profound and devastating. The psychological impact on surviving Japanese tank crews was profound and devastating. Those who were captured, whose disabled tanks left them with no choice but surrender, had to grapple with uncomfortable truths. Their tanks were not just outmatched, they were obsolete. The equipment they had trusted with their lives offered no protection against weapons the Americans used as standard infantry support. Intelligence officers interrogating prisoners noted a consistent pattern in their responses. Japanese tankers expressed shock at American firepower. They talked about the quantity and quality of American equipment. They mentioned the casual abundance of ammunition and supplies they had witnessed. Many expressed feelings of betrayal that their own leaders had sent them into battle with inadequate equipment while assuring them they had technological parity. One veteran tank commander who had fought in China since 1937 told interrogators that he had believed Japan would win the war through superior fighting spirit and devotion to the emperor. After Saipan, after watching machine gun bullets punch through his tank's armor, after seeing American Shermans shrug off Japanese anti-tank fire, he knew that spirit could not overcome material disadvantages. Training and courage meant nothing when your equipment was fundamentally inadequate. These reports were compiled, analyzed, and sent to commanders throughout the Pacific. The lessons learned at Saipan would inform Marine tactics for the rest of the war. Japanese tanks were not a serious threat. Standard infantry heavy weapons, particularly the 50 caliber machine gun, were effective against them. Combined with bazookas, 37mm anti-tank guns, and Sherman tanks, Marines had overwhelming firepower against Japanese armor. Word spread through Marine ranks quickly. You didn't need specialized anti-tank weapons to engage a Japanese tank. Your 50 caliber machine gun would do the job. This knowledge changed how Marines approached subsequent island battles. The fear that came with facing armor, the concern about tanks breaking through infantry lines, evaporated. Japanese armor became just another target, and not a particularly dangerous one. The contrast between American and Japanese aircraft design philosophy was now mirrored in their tank designs. American designers continuously improved tank protection while increasing firepower. Japanese designers attempted to add protection to later tank models, but lacked the powerful engines needed to maintain performance with added weight. The result was tanks that had lost their primary advantage without gaining compensating strengths. For the Japanese tank crews on Saipan that early morning in June 1944, and for every Japanese tanker who fought in the Pacific afterward, the lesson was brutal and clear. They were obsolete, their equipment was obsolete, their tactics, developed for a different kind of warfare against different opponents, were obsolete. And there was nothing they could do about it except continue fighting with what they had, knowing that survival was unlikely and victory impossible. The Marines on the other side learned different but equally important lessons. They learned that industrial might matters in modern warfare, that having better equipment in larger quantities makes an enormous difference, that courage, training, and fighting spirit, while important, cannot overcome fundamental material disadvantages, that the factories back home in Detroit, Pittsburgh, and Cleveland were as important to victory as anything that happened on the battlefield. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.